1 minute so that we can get at least 1 or 2 participants, and then we formally begin our session. Okay, thank you, fellows. So today's session, we are going to focus on a topical issue, which is one of the emerging issues for the region, and it's a global concern. Yeah, so the topic we are going to have a discussion on will be the issue about migrant communities, mobility, and issues to do with the climate change. And we've been fortunate enough to be able to get 2 great speakers on this, and one of us, the speaker that will take us through this to introduce for us what it means as a pandemic and to the migrant community is Dr. Kenneth Otieno Mollo, who holds a Bachelor of Law degree from Uganda Christian University and a Master's degree in Divinity and Theology from Kosin University in South Korea. He also graduated with a PhD in leadership from Yemyung Graduate University in South Korea. That was in February 2022. And Dr. Mollo is an expert on matters law, religion, transformative leadership, and issues to do with digital health, or rather what he calls e-health. Currently, he's an associate lecturer at Wesleyan United Methodist Theological College, Nairobi, and Wesleyan Yon Theological and Social Justice College in Mombasa. His research interests include the issues to do with eco-theology, gender, global migration, and pandemics. So he's going to give us a presentation on effects of pandemic on migrant community, and which is going to be focused on analysis from various sources. So the next speaker, the one who will come after him as a discussant, is Mr. Jared Owuor. So I'll introduce him at the time when he'll be doing the presentation. So currently the floor is yours, Dr. Otieno, and you have about, we'll be gracious enough to give you 18 minutes, so you can stretch it. Ideally, we give 15 minutes. So thank you.
My pleasure. The organizers, ARIN, Africa Research and Impact Network, and Mr. Agula, and the entire team. That's all much for concerning who I am and what I do. And I was let me say, fortunate or unfortunate to be in a foreign country at the height of a major pandemic, that's COVID-19. And that's basically what inspired this paper that I published in 2020. Sometime in 2020, 2021, that's when this paper was published by MDPI, which is a multidisciplinary journal. And it got a lot of traction in Asia because it is what has been used widely to compare pandemics, migration, and immigrants in both continents, almost all continents, because I was drawing from the African experience and looking at how it is with immigrants. And for the African context or most other places, when I talked about immigrants or migrants, I was referring to general refugees and asylum seekers. And in local context, you look at them as IDPs and also generally travelers or even wanderers like pastoralists. Or you can use this migrant on a broader sense to take care of generally itinerant persons, people who are not fixed into one place. And maybe I know Aaron is involved with a lot of researchers and in multidisciplinary approach. So maybe it is something that we want to tease out when it comes to pastoralists, because these are basically by and large wanderers, so to say, and you never know when a pandemic may strike. So the paper was titled Effects of Pandemics on Migrant Communities with a focus on COVID-19. And that's what I want us to focus on this particular hour. And I hope we will have a good time for the few minutes we're going to be here. So migration generally has an effect on the spread of diseases. And as it can potentially initiate outbreaks or change in prevalence of infectious diseases, because when infectious diseases take a different form or shape or manner in certain cases. And also that is for chronic disease or outbreaks like cholera and those what have you. But as migrant populations increase in an area, their interaction with the environment and disease-causing vectors contribute to emergence of infectious diseases. And you could pursue that line of thought further on that paper, which I invite you to address your mind to thereafter. And so COVID-19 pandemic specifically did not only expose, but it also did exacerbate the disadvantages faced by different genders due to government restrictions and a number of rules. So the paper itself, so that I can bring you up to speed, had a number of variables. The key aspect is migrants and pandemics, but I was examining this in light of religion and gender, because there's a lot to do with religion and gender when you're talking immigration, when you're talking pandemics and resilience, in so to say. Because this in my research on this paper, I found out that women kind of tend to develop they easily build coping mechanisms of in whatever circumstance they find themselves in, which was quite an interesting finding, because you would think men would be much adjusted to different or changing times, but research and many authors pointed out that women kind of have, in general circumstances, better coping mechanisms to changes that they find themselves in, especially in immigration situations when pandemics strike. And so rules pertaining to, when we talk about containment rules in such effects of pandemics, there were certain containment rules. I hope you probably can remember them, like cleaning, or where there are the gatherings, they were talking about social distancing and all these things. You realize that they present impossible situations to migrant communities by and large in their living and working conditions. Why? Because most of the time you realize that these communities are just transiting, and they live in spaces where enforcing such containment measures are pretty difficult or just impossible at all. For instance, when in research and in general practice or observation, if you can really remember, containing pandemics in refugee camps, like when you say observation of washing thoroughly thorough hand washing or thorough cleaning. You know that most immigrants or refugees or those in camps or IDPs in IDP camps, they don't, to begin with, have access to adequate, clean water, which already by itself is a hazard, a pandemic in itself waiting to happen in another form. If you talk about social distancing, ordinarily these people are crowded in small spaces. The tents they live in, the amenities they share, such as toilets and public amenities like birthplaces. If you've had an opportunity to visit a refugee camp, so to say, you know that such containment issues could only apply if you are talking about ordinary living conditions. But for immigrants or migrant communities, those are very challenging issues, and they, in one way or the other, contribute largely to spread of pandemics. So the aspect I've mentioned of gender, this paper had this gender aspect is very pronounced. If you take your time and address your mind to the paper, the gender aspect is very elaborate, and we're looking at how different genders were responding or adapting to the situations, or how they do it in during pandemic outbreaks. But we found out that men generally had a hard time adapting to the set containment issues while migrating and settling in new areas. Women, on the other hand, were found to adapt faster, and they exemplified greater levels of resilience and flexibility. And this, if you allow me to share a little bit, is because women kind of have many outlets to wind down, but men keep to themselves a lot. So that is one of the reasons that it was found that men were extremely affected. Migrant men were extremely affected, and they get extremely affected in cases of pandemic outbreaks. It is also argued that women are extensively known to have better psychological ways of dealing with change. And I've talked about that because of such support groups that women have in our context. You call them chamas. They have a way to share, but men, the fact that they kept to themselves. And so you see the correlation between pandemic, you see the correlation between gender and all things like coping mechanisms, and religiously also, globally, we know women form a bigger percent of faithfuls or among religious persons in a given area. Women tend to perform a bigger percentage, and because of those little things like adhering or subscribing to a particular religion, women tend to cope easily, because religion is also one way that they are able to let out that which affects them. So female migrant victims were, for example, found to have been placed in a worse position as they had lacked places to turn to for protection. Now, this in the gender aspect of effect of pandemic, during lockdowns and all things like that, there was research showed that there was something that affected women by and large. If in lockdown situations, they tended to lack places to turn to for they tended to lack places to turn to for things like in many places where there are desks to report something, or say a case of sexual abuse, rape, or things like that, or domestic violence. Those were missing links in pandemic situations. And this is extreme pandemic situations, and maybe not just extreme, sometimes even on ordinary pandemic situations where movement is restricted, women kind of suffer because of that, but not because of their ability or inability to cope. So it's something that you may want to take note of. And then several migrant women also reported being abused and introduced to organized crime due to the effects of pandemics. Like if they could not go to work and fend for their living, there are certain things that we found out were organized in our research, that maybe a rise in cases of clandestine brothels as means to generate livelihood. But you see that this has a back effect of spreading pandemics, which is something that now in the first place you're trying to contain. But if you have such clandestine things working, then you see communities and the pandemic still continues spreading. And their suffering were, however, aggravated by the point of that lack of support organizations, as I've mentioned, churches and mosques and government agencies, NGOs, which ordinarily would be good places for women to turn. If they cannot access these things, then again, their suffering is aggravated. And now migrant population also working in care facilities and professionals such as nurses and those who are in cleaning services, who by and large you find are women, also reported being affected a lot, because such professions and those institutions remain undervalued in most countries. And surprisingly, we found out that even in developed countries and rich countries like South Korea, there was an overstretch in health facilities and health personnel like nurses. They were working overtime and they were experiencing extensive working hours, which still has had an impact on how the pandemic could be contained, or how it could be contained, because with extensive working hours and few human resource or personnel, then things aren't that easy. So the situation was much harder for migrant women who lacked legal status in host country. But they find there are times that migrant workers or refugees, even if you go to Dadaab or Kakuma or wherever, there are people who are either trained as nurses and medical health practitioners or volunteers in these fields in health centers. But if they lack legal status, you find that they want to work undercover. And working undercover, meaning that even in cases of exposure to or having contracted such a pandemic, like in cases of COVID, what I saw where I was, through personal observation, such undercover workers in these sectors still try to hide themselves, hide their identities for fear of being exposed and for fear of being deported. So these are very extreme cases and in this paper, and those are interesting findings that we came across. And time is fast moving. I remember I was given, I think, moderator, I have about 4 or 5 minutes, right?
Yes, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, so thank you. Now, you can also think about the cases of instances of domestic and care workers in countries such as, interestingly, Europe was also not very far out in this problem. As you would imagine, as you would think that, oh, Europe is sophisticated, they are developed, and they have maybe cash to throw around and contain such matters. But what we found interestingly in our research concerning like a place like Spain, where domestic care workers are mostly women, most of them suffered from, they have this living arrangements with their employers. They come in and they go. And most of them, you realize, are not entitled to social benefit schemes such as pension or labor inspection or insurance, and also possibilities of working remotely through internet, which was available to people, mainstream persons and people in domestic work. You have to either walk in, perform them, you're present or absent, and that there's no two way about it. So even the hybrid nature of trying to contain pandemic don't come along well for certain professions like healthcare workers. And also, in conclusion, what this thing revealed to us, especially COVID, not just, and you can now expand it to the body pandemics at large, is that migrant communities and women specifically need targeted, specific responses in cases of pandemic outbreaks, such as the novel COVID-19. What that means is that it's not possible and it's not advisable to have a one-size-fits-all approach in containment measures. If researchers, policymakers, and organizations can come up with specific and targeted responses in cases of pandemics, say to this is purely targeted for the women folk, this is purely targeted for maybe youth because they're highly mobile and things like that, then we could in future have a better way to deal with these things. And so I want to rest my case there, and now we can probably find a way to extrapolate this discussion into other areas, because we realize that pandemics, migrants, and now you as at your desk right now, you're looking at areas of climate, and all these have to do with, they're all interrelated in one way or the other. So allow me to pause there and get to listen to our discussant of the day on the same, because I would be interested to hear what Mr. Ward prepares, how to deal with migrants and pandemics and climate change. Thank you very much for your time and listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Otieno, for the wonderful presentation. And it's good you've talked about some of these targeted responses. And just a quick one, I would ask now, borrowing now broadly from your study, what are some of these targeted responses? Can you highlight maybe one or two, but that will be a discussion during the next time. So right now I want to introduce, Dr. Mollo will stop sharing your screen. So I want to introduce to you the next speaker, who is Mr. Jared Owor-Aol. So Jared is a research operations manager at Samuel Hall. So he leads Samuel Hall's research operations in Africa and supports the development of research methodologies with a focus on issues of emerging technologies and the impact of refugee support services and systems. So as a researcher, some of his works focus on interlinkages between climate change impacts, migration and displacement patterns, return and reintegration, and more broadly on durable solutions to displacement, migrants' aspiration, and cross-border mobility. Jared holds a master's degree in public policy and administration from Kenyatta University and a bachelor's of arts in political science from the same university, that's KU, Kenyatta University. And part of his work, there are these flagship projects and publications, which include the ongoing habitat, the linkage between climate change, habitability, and social tipping points, the scenario for climate migration, CGRF ID, responding to protracted displacement in urban world, that is in Kenya, Ethiopia, Jordan, and Afghanistan. There's a South Sudan, decades of displacement, understanding return and questioning reintegration, ILO, digital refugee, livelihood and decent work, HIF, innovating mobile solution for refugees in East Africa, WUSC's market assessment of digital employment opportunity for refugee youths, and there's also a blog in terms of bridging refugee inequalities under COVID-19. So let us welcome Jared, and he'll have around 10-15 minutes to respond to part of the issues that were discussed by Dr. Otieno, but is also going to give us a highlight. He has prepared a presentation just on the gender dimension of the climate migration nexus. So Jared, would you want me to upload the slides, or you'll upload it from your end? And welcome for honoring us to be with us today.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Alphonse, and greetings everyone from wherever you're joining. And of course, it's a great pleasure to meet Ken. Ken, it was nice listening to your presentation. I know that we're going to find a few commonalities on what you've highlighted, and perhaps what I'd want to highlight, just to sort of clarify. I'm not going to directly respond to your presentation, but I'm just going to use the opportunity to also sort of, show what we do as an organization and some of the experiences I've had working on these topics as a researcher over the years. And yeah, so again, just to say thank you, good pleasure really to get to know Irene, thanks to Alphonse Mollo. And I want to believe that even beyond this, we will perhaps have a continuation of this conversation. So on to it. As an organization, Samuel Hall, we are a social enterprise. Mollo, maybe if you want to go to the next slides, just to, yes, on this, I'm just going to show you a bit of what we do as an organization, and then I will jump straight into the role of gender in climate change. And then lastly, we will talk about some of the recommendations that we are suggesting to really, in a way, find a very common approach in terms of responding to these issues. So as, next slide, please. Good, thank you. As an organization, we are a social enterprise that conducts research and we evaluate programs and design policies in the context of migration and displacement. Our research team focuses on how displaced communities experience consequences of different issues that we are currently dealing with as a globe, climate change being one of them. And we do this by through data, but also we share stories, experiences, and perceptions of those that are affected, to inform policies and programs. Now, drawing from our research, today I will focus on the key area of how gender plays a role in climate-induced displacement, and how many times it is a threat multiplier for women and young girls. We have been working in the Horn of Africa since 2014, documenting migration and displacement patterns, and all of our research, some of which I will detail today, and of course, Alphonse already mentioned them in passing, but I can share more later, points to the fact that it's not enough to talk about climate and migration or gender and migration, but that the critical way forward for partnership is at the triple nexus between climate, gender, and mobility. So we'll draw today on some of our work in Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, for instance, and some other locations. As you can see, we have a very broad geographical representation of just in Africa, but also across beyond to Central and Southern Asia and parts of Europe. Next slide. Alphonse, please, next slide. More broadly or swiftly in passing, our work is embedded on pillars. We have thematic expertise on multiple areas. One of them is migration and displacement, social equity, children and youth, implementation research, data standards, and analytics. So any publication or output that we have out there, it is anchored on any of these components. If we had time, I would have taken you into details, but that is not really much important for today, just for your information. So we move to the next slide and look at now, whoever is on the other side, please move with my speed in terms of the slides. I'd really appreciate. Good. Awesome. Thanks. So to sort of give me or give all of us the grounding of this conversation and what I'm about to present, we have a pillar, as I've already highlighted, on social equity. And with this, we have conducted a number of participatory research with marginalized communities with a clear objective of identifying models of equity and equality, for the future. And based on this, we have made a very deliberate decision to focus on thematic dimensions that we believe are interrelated and have a role to play in terms of policy formulation and different interventions that would help respond to some of these challenges. One of them is climate change. And here we work with different communities in terms of, picking or documenting experiences on consequences of climate change and other initiatives or local adaptation measures that have been put in place. We're also focusing on urban and, impacts of urbanization in different components or different, countries across the continent and other areas. We also have a very, very particular focus on gender. And we believe that, it is very essential to incorporate conversation on gender as we also look at social constructions. One, by developing different approaches, at the same time criticizing some of the models that are in existence. So our work, looks at, a number of issues across all those components. That said, I'd like to go straight into how gender plays a role in climate change. Maybe Alphonse, move with me, please. Thank you so much. Now, the climate crisis is far from gender neutral, no brainer. Okay, maybe sometimes, maybe not. But again, I think for us, it is pretty much clear that it is not gender neutral. We are well aware that it does not affect everyone in the same way. And in this way, somebody might ask how. Women, we know, as already alluded to by Ken, that women are always on the front lines of climate change and climate change adaptation. They are more reliant on natural resources for their day chores, but have also less access to them. They're disproportionately responsible for securing fuel, water, and food in many ways. They're also increasingly being forced to eat less, the first to drop out of school due to family pressures, and forced into marriage. That's some of the common challenges that we identify with at the normal African household. But of importance to highlight is that in fragile and conflict-affected environments, intensified social, political, and economic pressures, climate change is not just an ecological catastrophe. It is also essentially a matter of justice, prosperity, and gender equality. It is also strongly intertwined to and impacted by structural inequality and discrimination. So in displacement, women's roles also change, but within a context of extreme household vulnerability and with concerning protection risks. So while women are aware of climate shocks, they're also less prepared or equipped for what happens in displacement context. Our research shows that in displacement, economic activities are less gender dependent than pre-displacement in contexts like Somalia, where, for example, the IDPs of both genders who participate in agriculture, construction, and even mechanical services. But this doesn't mean that there is a positive impact on women's empowerment or labor market status in displacement. It reflects that the fact that IDP women cannot afford not to work, even if it entails working in extremely low-paying and potentially harmful jobs. So women's work tends to be less paid and more precarious compared to men's as a result of displacement caused by climate change. And here I think some people might be already familiar with the phrase of climate refugees and all this, which again is a conversation for another day, I believe. But yeah, next slide. Good. Now, we often hear that return is a solution, to, I don't know, did you go to the, I don't know, is that the immediate next slide, please? Or is the main one? Okay, fine. Let's keep it at that. Yeah, so we often hear that, you know, the return is a solution to a refugee crisis from the Horn of Africa to the Great Lakes and beyond, you know, just generally globally. So we conducted a study last year for the FAO on the challenges and opportunities of rural reintegration. And I'd like us to sort of give that some focus. Now, women face a number of risks without, you know, throughout their migration cycle. And while these risks exist, they also add to the risks of climate change. For those of you who are privy to the context of migration and to the different phases of you know, migration, you will perhaps relate more easily with what I'm trying to say. But here we find that stigma and discrimination are acute for women refugees, returnees, and those who have been associated with armed groups or have been victims of violence, exploitation, or even human trafficking. There are also additional barriers to reintegration expressed by women and financial constraints to consider. So here we find that women bear the burden of paid and unpaid work or care work. They also face barriers to access or claim land when they return to rural areas due to customary systems that, of course, we all know do not recognize women's land or inheritance rights. They do not always have control over the, you know, use of their money. Their families or in-laws are often, you know, in charge of deciding who receives money, how much, and what it is spent on. Yet at the same time, women make crucial contributions. We already saw that from what Ken was talking about. Women make, you know, crucial contributions to rural development and are much needed actors in the agricultural sector. So a 2019 study shows that female returnees play a large role in agricultural development, for example, in Vietnam. So we found that the same is true in the study that I already talked about that we conducted with the FAO in 2022 from Kenya to Senegal. Men's return is often associated with poor employment, you know, outcomes. Women, it's actually due to personal reasons. Women grapple with marriage issues, childbearing, caring for elders. They also care for the environment socially. So when climate change becomes harder, the impact on their livelihoods becomes stronger in rural areas, and their role in social cohesion also becomes, you know, more important. So we are already seeing cross-cutting connections, you know, in all these components. But in the next slide, I want to speak about how vulnerabilities, or all these vulnerabilities, can turn into opportunities for climate change mitigation. Next. So yeah, these all indicate that there is a space to turn women's vulnerability to climate change into an opportunity to invest in their capacity and their roles, you know, locally. For example, in Sudan, you know, the number of women farmers as well as women carrying, you know, out traditional male roles has grown due to climate change and environmental degradation. In those who are familiar with, you know, Sudan, in a place known as, or a state known as North Kordofan, rising temperatures, uneven distribution, and variable rainfall and drought forced many women, you know, many men to migrate to urban areas in search of employment. This, in essence, has transformed the roles of women who remain behind, who have stepped in to provide their roles in the absence of their husbands, and, you know, who now show a great understanding of climate adaptive solutions than men as a result. So if we now turn to internal displacement and climate change in Somalia, for example, our research, which we conducted in collaboration with IOM in 2019, in several displacement affected communities, suggested a significantly higher level of awareness among women regarding adaptive, you know, accommodations and community level solutions. A joke is made that women usually, most of the times, pretty much sort of aware of how to navigate some of these societal challenges as compared to us. Sometimes I tend to agree largely, but again, those other outliers. But that aside, we find that when we asked, you know, about adaptive accommodations, men and women had different answers. You know, female climate included IDP respondents in Somalia preferred longer-term strategies, such as planting trees, over short-term measures, such as raising the level of the house or migration to another part of the city. So most women, you'd find that they want to focus on what we call in situ adaptation measures, where they want to find different solutions just within the localities. Unlike other people, perhaps men largely, so to speak, would consider migration as an adaptive measure, So those are things that the nuances that we also find out in this context. So this places women to better advise and drive responses that will promote economic security and health in the context of disaster displacement. So we are agreeing, and this is our position from the studies that we've conducted, that women can play a central role to address inequalities and contribute to resilient communities. That inclusion and meaningful participation or even leadership in climate adaptation and mitigation efforts is crucial. With them being on the front line, it enables them to be more aware and conscious of solutions and efforts that locally affect and mitigate the risks of climate change. This, for example, has led us, for instance, in our evolution of the EU's migration portfolio in Kenya, to argue for not just mainstream the environment and gender, but actually build the next 7 years of programming on the nexus of gender, migration, and the climate. So already I think we are having a very kind of informed flow of conversation on how the different dynamics on these thematic areas relate or differ in one way or the other. The next slide is just sort of to draw attention to how to understand the migration cycle. So with our work, as a research entity that focuses on building knowledge, our focus on different needs at different phases of the migration cycle is of importance to us. And with this, I'd say that we need to break down the migration cycle and the phases of migration where women need extra support. Sometimes we look at it just holistically, but we understand that even with migration as a context, each stage presents unique challenges, even to men. It's not to say men are left out, but even to men as well. But for this particular conversation, I'd like to look at in terms of the pre-displacement phase, during displacement phase, and of course, after return, and even when we're having the conversation on return in the reintegration process. So at the pre-displacement stage, with a focus on women's well-being and mental health, we would like to include women's capacity or even spotlight women's capacity to manage social and environmental stressors, especially in communities where men have already migrated and women now occupy dual roles of caregiving and providing financially for their families, but also by expanding safe migration pathways for women. One of the studies that Alphonse already mentioned at the beginning, that we are doing with the EU on habitability. We are trying to question the concept of habitability in Kenya, focusing on 2 counties, Baringo and Makueni. And one thing that we are actually finding out is still the component of vulnerability of women. And we realize that in most of this, especially if you look at Makueni, for example, you realize that in a number of households, women are playing dual roles because men already had moved to urban areas or other areas to sort of look for other alternatives in terms of funding for their families. And with that, while they're looking at it as a way to adapt to the situation, it also it puts more pressure on women. And sometimes even their men are not privy to the level of impact that has on their mental health and well-being. But that said, another focus is on during displacement. Now, here our focus, I'd like to draw your focus on physical and material security, as women displayed significantly higher unemployment rates and are more likely to live in a makeshift shelter in displacement. There are also concerns on protection, given the risks of SGBV that they face during displacement. The adverse effects of climate change and disasters often exacerbate pre-existing risks of rights violations for women and girls within such communities. And then lastly, at after return, we talk about reintegration. The plan for a more inclusive model of rural integration linking women's employment, value chains, and the gender in agro-food systems that lead to certified high-value products. And of course, fund women-led environmental programs, So it is important as change makers in this sector to be much more aware of this migration cycle dynamics and find, specific, solutions to address them. The next slide, I want to now look into the way forward in terms of partnerships, the policies and programming. Thinking ahead, it is really important to understand how policies, collaboration, programming can help to reduce the risks of women and young girls. Partnership can help women who are coping with the dual challenges of climate change and displacement. The key will be to involve a variety of partners, from various climate vulnerable locations for more major investments, aid, and transfer of tech expertise that can lead to improved adaptability with the legal framework to the particular protection needs of women. I know Ken mentioned, his interest on e-health. I also have a very particular interest on use of technology to support, migration in terms of having the tech and migration nexus. And what we probe most of the times are some digital related solutions to this effect. But of course, I'm digressing a little bit, but just to point out really that these are some of the areas that we can really probe more partnership and how we can have this expertise, focused in terms of providing solution. Now, women farmers, for example, often lack timely access to climate information and the capacity to even translate weather or climate forecasts into suitable adaptive responses vis-a-vis the planting of crops, for example. We can build on best practices from India to train women as climate risk managers and ensure they receive climate information services. So training women communicators will overall enhance access to an understanding of climate information for communities, applying a group approach to the demand for climate information in communities, and ensuring that farmers, collectives, and local community groups play a role in facilitating women's capacity to act on climate information. So our overview of different interventions that are currently in place, especially in the Kenyan context or in the Horn of African context, we are saying that there is a need for future research on a number of areas. One of them is land use and land management. And you also, by extension, we talk about livelihoods and training in refugee hosting areas, hydrological assessments, you talk about debt, gender assessments, and the green economy, including costing and the feasibility studies on the unexplored potential in the field of green and circular, economy. After 2 challenging years that are impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is largely more like a response or a contribution on what my colleague talked about, the foundation of EU funding, for example, going forward, and even other funding. I'm mentioning EU because, again, they pump in more investments in this space. But of course, this goes to even other funding agencies. It needs to go forward, in a way to rethink approaches on climate, gender, market systems, advocacy. How can partners systematically, develop climate adaptive interventions to mitigate the impact of current droughts and natural disasters on livelihoods, housing, and the socioeconomic fabric? How can stakeholders like Erin, like Samuel Hall, like any other actor in this space place gender adaptive and transformation frameworks at the center of their theories of change? What advocacy strategy should all of us and other partners develop to promote legal solutions to unlock market access registration and documentation for forcibly displaced populations? Now, future funding needs to focus on solving the water issue and adapt to fast worsening environments, where agriculture and climate adaptation cannot be, separated anymore. I have one more slide to go, but I know I've also, I don't know what my timing looks like, Alphonse. Do I have like a minute or two to just swiftly look at the last slide?
Quickly keep it to a minute. And,
all right.
As you just focus on it, I just want to invite the audience. If somebody has a question, feel free to post it. Otherwise, continue.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. This is my last slide. And I just sort of want to bring in the question on localization of partnership and funding. And with this, in the recent days, we've really been actively having this conversation on localization. And the question is, how do we localize the interventions that are in place, and even from a research perspective? One of the things that we are doing as an organization is to work with refugee-led organizations and to include women in advocacy and conduct engagements and outreach activities to ensure their voices and perspectives are included in movement building efforts. So we need to initiate proper documentation on traditional knowledge systems, and using this system as a basis for collaboration, we believe, and I personally believe, will help prioritize the rights and leadership of women and girls. Again, another component is information provision and trust building around these changes in the environment and climate change is needed. So focusing on the communities themselves, up to date and localizing information that is required, and all this is of very key importance. Another component is climate research, policy and diplomacy. I know some of the organizations that are actually here today for this conversation already have things that they're doing in this space, but I want to believe that we should all account for the situation of women and girls in displacement to identify the links, not just between gender and climate change, but between gender, migration, climate change. That's something that we are strongly advocating for. And finally, we are discussing partnering also with the refugee-led organizations to get their voices from the field to policymakers. We don't want to speak, for them. We want refugees to speak for themselves. We want women to speak for themselves. We want girls to speak for themselves. We can just help to amplify their voices by documenting this. But I think the onus is with them. So it is high time that we actually brought the conversation from the community level to the policy discussion table. So I'd like to invite you guys, last slide, to just invite you to interact with some of our work on climate change. And of course, check out our website. You can reach out to me on that email address. And I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter. Feel free to continue this conversation. And I believe even out of this, we can also still have conversation about even proper partnership with some of you if there is really any interest or commonality in the work we do. So thank you so very much, Alphonse. And I'm very much happy that we're having this conversation. Over.
Thank you very much, Jared, for the great presentation, and Kenneth, also the wonderful presentation. At this point, I want to open it up for the audience to ask questions. So don't, feel free for Francophone, you just let us know, and we are blessed to have one of our very own Dr. Joe, who will do the translation for us. So one of the questions goes to you, Dr. Otieno. Thank you for your presentation. Please, what was your research method, and was your focus only on the receiving communities, or even back from the communities that are sending the communities where these refugees are from? And yeah, thank you. So thank you very much. So I can see there is a hand raised up. So there is a hand that has been raised up. So sorry. Okay, so if you've raised up your hand, please just unmute, then shoot the question.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation, Dr. Jarrett and Dr. Otieno. I like how the intersectionality between the first presenter on the migrant communities and the intersectionality with gender. But I'm more curious on the data availability. we understand that comprehensive and accurate data on migrant communities can be challenging. But is there some statistics justify, for instance, that women are being more affected? And I think it will also be interesting comparative analysis based on these statistics on, say, from a country basis or regions, providing some insights on how migration policies and health systems have affected the migrant communities during the pandemics. Also, in terms of context factors, would be very much interesting to know the effects of the migrant communities, depending on the region or the local context, and also if you've done some policy and say migration policies, healthcare system, and the social support networks based on a country or regional basis. So thanks.
Thank you, Brian. That's brilliant. So that is, I believe, to the first presenter on the issue about data and the comparative analysis and the issue about health systems and migration. And I also there was something that I had written somewhere here for our second discuss and the question about the tracking matrix, because it ties closely to the question about data availability. And I wanted to ask Mr. Jared if you can highlight if there's some sort of, there are different forms of refugees, or there's the IDPs, there are political refugees, there are those who are seeking asylum, economic refugee. But now we are, climate change is a threat multiplier, and at the same time, we find climate change as creating some sort of it's like it can be a push on many other issues, or it kind of exacerbate other issues. So the bigger question is now, how then do we justify, it's, I know it's part of the questions that it's really hard to track, but it's important. We have a tracking matrix for climate refugees, and how do we integrate that with the entire system of refugee discussion in issues of climate change? So thank you. So I'll invite who would want to come first, Dr. Otieno or Dr. Jared?
I don't mind going first. I appreciate.
Yes, go first, Ken, and then I will respond as well.
Yeah, I was going first anyway. Thank you very much, Jared, and wonderful presentation. And I really appreciate the way you tie in the issue of gender still with climate change, because we definitely are going to find a common ground on some of these variables that we have to tackle in a multidisciplinary research of such a nature. And you've really done a great job to point out where and how these things correlate. And much for that. I will begin with Delali. I think Delali is the one who posted a question much earlier when I was still presenting, and was very curious on my research methodology. On what I would like to bring us to speed on is, in cases of pandemics, especially like the one we were dealing with, that was extremely novel, COVID. There was no time, the whole globe had been brought to a standstill because of a pandemic. Now, in such cases, it's true and factual that there wasn't much data to draw from in such a sense. However, good enough, a lot of researchers went into place around about that time, focusing on various areas. Some were specifically based on health and containment, some were social gatherings, and some were religious effects, and so forth, so on and so forth. And so in such cases, there's always a methodology that is appreciated among researchers in instances like this, which comes in handy. And you want to address your mind to a methodology that they call grounded theory. In a grounded theory, you may not find a lot of data or information or statistics, so to say, for what you're looking, about what you're researching upon. but you have some leverage to borrow or put information in a way that is neither strictly here, not there, but there's room to wiggle your feet and let in other discussion, let in other researchers or other experts of the thing, probe your assertions or your submissions based on that. But that doesn't mean that you become an academic rumamonga, so to say. You have to base your argument on certain things. For instance, in our case, and that now partly comes to Brian on statistics and data or the sources of information. You realize that in my research, I tackled almost an entire globe. I didn't limit it to a specific geographical area, and that gave me the freedom to use. My paper is titled "An Analysis of Existing Sources." In other words, you draw from the sources that are already existing or the works of other peoples that have addressed their mind to your germane subject, and you draw from their line of thought and you borrow from their statistics and make also where necessary, because there was even no room to go for field and take accurate data, or maybe things like interviewing persons and all those. But if you pick from analysis, it's more like what you would call a desktop research, in the sense that you're going to be picking from a pool of already existing researchers around about the same subject, but you be particular to flesh out that which you're looking for in your research. If that makes sense, maybe. And if you want to pursue it further, you still have my email address on there, and I'm also on LinkedIn. So it's a discussion you can pursue further with me based on that. And then you asked a question which you share with the Delali again, whether I was just drawing from local context, and Delali was more concerned, wanted to know whether it's from both sending or host nations, more as against to receiving or origin. Now, if you follow my line of thought, you realize that I'm piggybacking I'm going back and forth between host and receiving, host, receiving, or sending and origin. Why that is because if my research was not focused on a particular geographical area for that particular purpose. I was looking at the whole spectrum of when pandemics strike, how does it affect migrants? How does it affect migrants in relation to their religion? How does it affect migrants in relation to gender? So it was a whole broad spectrum, but now the things you are teasing out and are the things you will find in my recommendation down under on my paper, which now invites more researchers to pursue. You can now specifically say, I want to pursue this research further in regard to this particular area. So that is, you see, I leave an open window for an interested researcher to also carry forward the conversation in that sense. It's not closed-ended, and I don't make it as absolute. There is still room to improve on it in my conclusion. If you read, I hope I've attempted to respond adequately to that which was raised.
So Dr. Otieno, you'll have an opportunity maybe to give, if you have other comments, just to tie up. So I want to invite Jared to just say a word or two concerning the question about, there was a question about, again, to throw himself into the pool of data and give us if there's some sort of like data on this, or a case in which you can be able to track a matrix for tracking refugees.
Thank you, Alphonse. And I want to believe this question was asked by Brian O'Ward. Now, first off, if today we were to really talk about the crisis of our time, then we would talk about climate change. And at the same time, tied to some of its most devastating consequences. It is not a sub-Saharan kind of problem. It is not an African problem. It's not a Western problem. It is a global problem. Now, in this spectrum, we have, or we must have had the phrase, the forgotten victims of climate change. Why do we say that there are forgotten victims of climate change? One, because on data front, we realize that we have limited information on people who are fleeing their homes due to disasters and other weather events. But that said, it doesn't mean that we do not have some sort of a clear conceptual understanding of the magnanimity of those that are affected. For example, if you look at the work that some of these organizations do, for example, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, if you like, the study that they have conducted shows that the number of those that have been displaced by climate change-related disasters since 2010 at the moment stands at 21 million or even more. And that is at the same time pointing towards having more problems or devastating effects of climate change, you see. So it has got some complex interwoven impacts that we are talking about. While I know there are organizations that sort of track, have a metrics of tracking displacement. For example, I think IDTM, I don't know whether they call it IDTM or what, but we have organizations that actually have got an open data system that have figures and numbers on these, the affected or the victims of climate change. We still believe that much more needs to be done in terms of having, country-specific or a population-specific data, so that we have a very kind of targeted intervention approach, especially when it comes to women and girls. Beyond that, us as an organization, and I was already alluded to, we have conducted a number of studies, and the question of, do we have studies that are really validating the assertion that women are mostly affected? Yes, a lot of it. I'd actually challenge you to read more about this. One of the studies that we have conducted recently on identifying climate adaptive solutions to displacement in Somalia points to that fact, and points to the fact that they, at the same time, they're also much aware of, what needs to be done. All they need is just, the support, to ensure that we have got those measures at the community level, So all this information is in place, but we want them to be more focused on this subset of the population because they're unique in as they come, and even beyond that, based on location. And swiftly, I think on the same question you asked about the connection or causal relations between government policies and solutions that are in place. Of course, this is also very clear, no-brainer. Every country, their policies have to directly have an impact, negative or otherwise, to how some of these responses are taken into place. Today, if you speak about refugee policy in place in the region, perhaps you would fly high the Ugandan flag in terms of the refugee policy and how to respond to durable solutions and some components in addressing challenges that refugees in Uganda go through. That would be different if you look at other countries, and even if you compare side by side to Kenya or even Ethiopia and all this. So as change makers and as experts who want to contribute into policy, we have to probe this with all the uniqueness and contextualizations that they deserve. So at the end of the day, we have tailored responses to some of these challenges. Over to you, Alphonse.
Thank you very much. It's getting much better that while we are edging towards the end. So I'll read, there's a question by Charles on our chat, and I honored to read all the questions that were going to be written there. I'll also give an opportunity to, so let me read the question, then give an opportunity to Juliet to ask a question, but I'll also invite, because we haven't heard from our scholars and brothers from the Francophone, so I'll give one of them and will preferably already an opportunity. Just raise a question or ask a question as we continue. So the question is from Charles, and it's Dr. Tunoi has noted that the agency of women in decision-making processes is a prerequisite for inclusivity in terms of decision-making. So it has been highlighted, and you've highlighted, and it will be good to have more insights on how it can be sustained. It can be sustained towards having women leading in decision-making. And many thanks to Dr. Otieno and Jared. And then Brian Okoth has the question of how do effects of climate change to immigrants compare to the host community? Take for instance, like Dadaab, this is now my addition, and the community around there. Is there evidence of the same? Certain there will be cases where, due to severe intervention targeting migrants, their resilience has been enhanced compared to host community. So, Juliet, take it on.
Thank you so much, Mollo. And I really appreciate Dr. Otieno and Mr. Owl Jared for the presentation. So my question basically is directed to Jared. But before then, I would really like to appreciate how women's inclusion in adaptation and mitigation efforts is really key when we talk about addressing inequalities and contributing to resilient communities. So I have 3 questions, and my apologies in case any of this was addressed while I had connection issues. But number 1 is, have you come across any examples or case studies where gender responsive policies or interventions have successfully addressed the gender dimensions of the climate migration nexus? And I'm also curious to find out whether there are any differences when it comes to experiences and the impacts posed by climate change on rural women, and or rather compared to the urban women. And my last question is around the implement, and this is posed to all the other participants as well. What are the potential implications of overlooking or neglecting the gender dimensions within the climate migration research, or other policies and interventions? I believe this is a topic not really explored in our research, and I stand to be corrected, but if we could just brainstorm on what are some of the potential implications of really overlooking or neglecting this kind of dimensions, gender dimensions. Thank you, and I appreciate both speakers.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliet, for summing it up, and looking forward what some of these gender dimensions. So I'll invite Dr. Teller just to raise this question, but he'll have an opportunity also to kind of respond just as we finish.
My questions are very simple and straightforward. To Dr. Otieno, what do you see as the place of migration in the changing space of adaptation to climate change? Because we are talking about really changing circumstances, even in terms of migratory resources and land and the dynamics of the economies. We have a lot of rural to urban kind of movement. Might not necessarily be linked to climate change, but think about it because migration has been a traditional kind of approach to managing or responding to climate change, especially for certain marginalized communities like the pastoralists. So think about that. And for Jared, thanks a lot for the gender discussion, which I find to be very interesting. I was recently moderating a session at the Africa Futures Conference in Germany. And one of the issues that came up was whether gender approaches, the way they're being promoted, which of course, not to criticize the work, but also you've taken that dimension of feminizing gender, and whether that approach is actually leading to justice or injustices to certain groups, gender groups, especially men in this case, because there were concerns that a lot of men in the African societies are being marginalized simply because the entire world, the entire research community, the entire policymaker, everybody thinks that gender is now is about supporting and empowering women and making them, be very, and with that push, resources have been pulled into that process. Advocacy groups have come into that process. Policies, gender-specific policies, which are basically feminine policies, have been made. And all these have sort of pushed a certain gender into the periphery. So while gender was meant to promote justice, equity, but we see a situation whereby it is, now creating more injustices and equity. But I would like to hear your thoughts about that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Prof, for the useful and wonderful highlights. So there's the last question here, and I would want, Fatima, would you just switch on your mic and I go ahead and ask the question. And yeah, so it's actually Fadumo. Can I go ahead and ask you, so what is the difference between migration and displacement? And the other one is from, I think this, you'll give them the microphone to, please, caller, just switch on your microphone and Dr. Joseph will do the interpretation.
Mollo, in the meantime, as Dr. Joe reads out the question, may I please request that the participants who are listening in English to switch to English interpretation so that they'll be able to hear Dr. Joe.
Okay, participants just switch to English, and as Paula will go ahead with the question. Thank you.
So maybe,
ok, merci. Je ne sais pas si je peux m'exprimer en français. Ok, merci à tous pour cette présentation. Je m'excuse du retard également. Je voudrais avoir un peu une idée assez précise sur la proportion, en tout cas, des migrants qui sont dus effectivement au changement climatique sur l'effectif total de ces migrants. Parce qu'on sait que la migration, c'est certainement dû à plusieurs, en tout cas, causes. Donc, je voulais avoir en tout cas ceux vraiment affectés par le changement climatique sur l'effectif total. Ça nous permet d'avoir une idée assez précise en tout cas de la question dont nous sommes en train de discuter. Merci.
Yeah, and Dr. Kasim is asking, is there any strategy or policy? Sorry. So Dr. Kasim is asking, is there any strategy or policy related to have this developed, I think in the context of mobility, migration, and issues of climate change. So because we are winding up, we'll encourage bilateral between we, the audience, we, the scholars here, and our discussants, our speakers for today. So what we'll do is I'll give them 1.5 minutes each to address the list of questions, the most burning issue, and to just give their closing remarks. So 1 minute to address the question, and 30 seconds, you give a closing remark, and then you hand over.
Okay, thank you so much, Alphonse. In the interest of time, I want to have an approach that will answer perhaps 3 people at the same time. This would be Juliet and Dr. Taylor, and I think there's another question. And this, of course, we know that the concerns have been expressed about issues of much more focus on women and all the other areas that comes with it. But again, as I already mentioned in my presentation, we are in agreement that due to social norms, men and women experience climate change differently. However, I want us to look at something I'd refer to as from vulnerability to precariousness and marginalization. So we know that with the context as it is, climate-induced, refugees or IDPs are torn between contradictory dynamics. The one is a world that they are familiar with, which is their home or the non-locality, and a world that they no longer know, which is, or a world that they do not know about, which is where they're going to really start a new life as far as all these adaptive measures are concerned. Now, this process, we would talk about precariousness or double marginalization. And with the concept of double marginalization, that is where now you see that people, or those of us who are in this space, are trying to give women more voice when we speak about gender, but that does not mean that the conversation about the challenges and the vulnerabilities that men go through is forgotten. What we are trying to say that as we have this conversation, we should not run the risk of falling in the precariousness trap because of the multiple compounding factors that are involved in all these conversations. Again, there was an issue of urban and rural. At the same time, same approach. We look at different dimensions of concern, housing, healthcare, and education. So these indicators, when we synthesize the situation of climate-induced, movement, we realize that, poor housing, fear of eviction, and all these are indicative of structural instability that, of course, would put maybe side by side all the challenges that the rural, crew and the urban crew go through. Lastly, I want to speak to, briefly what I think Brian Okoth had asked, the effects of climate change to, migrants, in this case, we could say refugees compared to the host communities. Of course, there has to be a difference. Again, still the issue of vulnerability to precariousness or even double marginalization. In Kenya, for example, right now for a number of years, we've been talking about the Kalobeyei Integrated Socioeconomic Development Plan, the KISEDEP. And with this, we are seeing an attempt to comprehensive multi-sectoral input to respond to both the predicament that the refugee community is going through and those that the host communities are going through. That is the only way that we are going to bridge the gap in a way that we can respond to the increasing needs and risks and vulnerabilities that are faced by these two, conversations. That is why we are also, formulating the conversation of response to development. So whereas there are differences, we are saying the approach does not, have an imbalanced approach in terms of responding to these concerns. If I didn't respond to your question, I really apologize. But in the interest of time, kindly feel free to get in touch after this and we can continue with this. Over to you, Alphonse. Thanks.
Yeah, so Dr. Mollo, and that is Dr. Jared, thank you very much. Please let this conversation continue. And what I want us to continue is to have this culture of not just meeting here, but even meeting afterwards to continue. So Dr. Otieno, please give us your closing remarks.
By closing remarks, quick one on to respond to Dr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor has handled pretty well what his concern concerning migration and the changing place of climate change. I think he has done justice. But also, I think there is something that I could draw your attention to, Dr. Atela, on the same, because this is really a big issue in the global scale and it's being recognized. And there's a White House report on the same, which was signed by the president of the US on, it's a report by ReliefWeb, a report done by the White House, published by ReliefWeb on impact of climate change on migrant, this issue, migration. And one of the things that they recognized is that there's need to rebuild and enhance programs to settle refugees and to plan for the impact of climate change on migration. It is a policy issue by and large. So that's, allow me to rest it on that for now, that one, it has gained recognition as a big force, and two, it is a policy issue that until policymakers sit to address it, it's still going to be something that is going to be back and forth, talked about in forums like the ones we are having, but not really addressed, specifically take care of what it needs to be addressed for what it is. And so maybe if that works, and then for my closing remarks, I want to appreciate the entire ARIN community organization for giving us an opportunity to delve into this discussion around gender, around migration and around climate change, because it is really the matter of the time, and we cannot run away from it from whichever perspective, whether through in religion or in whatever sector you find yourself in, you'll always be confronted by this issue. So thank you so much, and to the participants also, we appreciate you for coming and being here to listen and to take part and also bring up these matters that you raise. We believe that, I personally believe that we shall have more to talk back and forth concerning this, and we shall debate, dialogue more concerning how to make some of the proposals we make on this for us reality to address issues of our time. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much. So Delilah's just responded to one of the questions raised on displacement and migration, so that it's addressed to the topic of displacement. One is forced, there's the element of force, and the other one is voluntary. So, but this we can, I'm hoping, like, I hope Jared and Dr. Otieno, you can give us probably next week. There seems to be now a lot of interest in this, and we can yield you another Friday. So that Jared, I know that there's a study that is going on, and part of the discussion, remittances by refugees is addressing issues like, the need to appreciate that refugee can be you, it can be me, and anyone can be a refugee. And according to the estimates, in the next, by 2040, 2050, there's going to be approximately, if not nothing is done under the usual business as usual scenario, where globally we are going to have 1.2 billion people who are going to be climate refugees. So it's important really to engage in this kind of conversation, either to start developing safety nets and avoid that kind of a catastrophic displacement of 1.2 billion people. But at this point, I have to invite our convener, Dr. Atela, to give us closing remarks. And I'm sure Juliet always say you'll turn on after his remarks, you turn on your, don't go away, turn on your camera for a virtual selfie. So Dr. Atela, Prof. Karib.
Thank you, Mollo. I think time has gone. So mine is just to thank the presenters for wonderful, thought-provoking presentations. And number two is just to urge us to continue engaging in these discussions. And more importantly, is that as we engage in these discussions, let's try to to challenge some of the norms that have been sort of dominating our discourses with regards to some of these issues, because I think one of the problems that Africa is grappling with today is the lack of progress on SDGs, despite all these investments on different issues. The poverty situation is not, improving. So that raises the question around what is the problem. So that means that maybe, just maybe, we need to unpack better what the issues are and to really understand these complexities and challenge some of the normative ways in which development and interventions in terms of social interventions, economic interventions have been framed and embedded within the society. So I'm really happy that we are having these kinds of conversation, and I think we should basically proceed and continue to challenge the norms, question some of the things, discuss issues. That's actually the essence of ARIN, just to bring minds, thought leaders together to begin really unpacking some of these issues and trying to really understand the complexities that are facing us, because really African context is not one of. There are many things that we are beginning to understand are very critical in determining the progress of the continent. Otherwise, thank you very much, and look forward to the next discussions, and have a lovely evening wherever you are.
Thank you very much, our convener, Dr. Chela. So please just turn on your camera, and Brian is going to give us some instruction that in 1, 2, 3, he wants us to give the best of our smile. Switch on your video. We want to do a virtual selfie. It's our tradition. Please. Merci. Thank you. I'm seeing Ferdinand is really struggling the other side. Ferdinand, that's great. Yeah, I see Dr. Otieno is here. Florence, your camera seems to be not working or very much working. Oh, great. Koala, merci beaucoup. I can see you're here. Thank you. Yeah, I can read. Thank you very much from Mollo. That was thought-provoking. Thank you. And thank you, Emily. So as we're waiting. So Brian, are you ready? Brian, we are waiting. Are you ready? Brian Otieno. I know there's I can see other brands here. And
yes,
Dr. Joseph.
Everything is set.
Everything is set up. Great. So
on a count of 3, we go.
Thought you already took the photos, Brian.
Yeah, so 1, 2, 3. Nice. Yeah, we are good.
Okay, thank you everyone, and enjoy your weekend. Let's keep keep on with this thought-provoking discussion, and enjoy your weekend. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. And thanks very much.
Merci bien. Bon weekend.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph, Joe. It's always a pleasure hosting you and seeing the wonderful you're doing. Thank you.